Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is a podcast about the impact of graphic design. Today on the show, I have a wide-ranging conversation with the designer, writer, and educator, Rachel Berger. Rachel is currently the chair at the California College of Arts in San Francisco and previously worked as a designer at SYPartners and on Michael Bierut's team at Pentagram. Her writing has appeared in Design Observer, Significant Objects, and CLOG. Rachel majored in American Studies during her undergrad at Yale, and this is where that conversation begins. We talk about what those classes were like and what she was studying and thinking about and writing about, and how this led to her interest in graphic design. We talk about her responsibilities as the chair of a design program, and especially a design program that's in the middle of Silicon Valley, and how this role has changed her own thoughts on graphic design. Finally, we talk about balancing administration and creativity, encouraging criticality, and how her writing informs her design work. This is truly one of those conversations that could have easily gone on for another hour. There is so much we could talk about, and Rachel, I think you'll see, thinks really deeply about all of this work. So I just really enjoyed this one. I think that you will too. If you're a fan of the podcast and want to help support it, you can become a member for $5 a month or $50 a year. Members get an exclusive monthly newsletter that features behind-the-scenes content, links and articles from former guests about design and writing and criticism, as well as previews of the upcoming episodes. Scratching the Surface is fully supported through these memberships, so if you like the show and want to help with its ongoing production, I hope that you'll consider joining. Thanks for listening and enjoy this episode with Rachel Berger. I saw that you went to Yale for your undergrad and you did American Studies, and I kind of want to start there and kind of talk about what that means and what that looks like. I've talked to other people who have majored in American Studies, but I don't quite know what that is, and so I'm kind of curious, what were you studying? What were you interested in? When you're 17, 18, 19. Going to Yale, what were your interests? What were you kind of wanting to do?
Yeah, so it's funny. I think that when I was figuring out what to study, and my friends were also figuring it out, I felt like we fell into two camps: people who chose a major that they were interested in, and people who choose a major that they thought they had to study, like they felt a sense of duty to study. And for me, I was selfish and chose something that, like, for me, had the most interesting classes. Like, I would look at the book of listing all the courses, and it was always classes that ended up to being American Studies classes that jumped out at me as the most intriguing. And maybe that's because American Studies is a really broad and kind of mysterious, I don't even know if I would call it a discipline, right? Because it's like, if you think of everything you know of that has the word studies appended to it, it probably fits within American Studies, right? So like urban studies, film studies, ethnicity, race and migration studies, African American studies, gender studies is all American Studies, at least at Yale. And I was interested in all of those things. So even though I knew there was no such thing as a job in American Studies, I would just go ahead and explore it and try it.
I guess I have kind of two things there. I think you're exactly right about the blurriness of that as a discipline. The reason I started with that question, I was just talking to someone the other day about how I've been thinking about, would I want to get a PhD in art history and kind of do some sort of design history focused? And the person I was talking to was like, it might be more interesting to do an American Studies program, and focus on some part of design history that's a little bit more open. You can kind of do it a lot of different things. I was like, yeah, I know people who have done American Studies. I don't know what that means. And I think that kind of openness makes sense.
I think you should do it. And, to give you a couple examples of how it worked for me, like I was writing papers about like Sassy Magazine or about like Nirvana song lyrics. My senior thesis was a cultural history of the Adopt a Highway program. The Adopt a Highway program is basically just a signage system, right? So I was looking at graphic design, but from this cultural studies perspective.
Yeah, I have two questions. I want to go back to something you said earlier and then kind of connect it to what you were just saying. You said you were looking through the course catalog, you were looking through the curriculum, and there were these you saw, all the books that you'd be interested in reading, or the, courses, they were all in American studies. What were you interested in? It sounds like there was some visual cultural stuff, but do you remember what those books were where you're like, oh, I want to read this, I want to study, I want to learn more about this?
I think something that I was interested in was both urban studies and suburban studies, like how the American landscape came to be shaped the way it was, like why I grew up living on a cul-de-sac outside of, in Portland, Oregon, which, is this theoretically a suburban paradise in a subdivision that used to be a Christmas tree farm. Why did that happen? And what did that mean about the culture of this country? And something that is really interesting in the way American studies is structured in terms of your introduction to the discipline is it's structured around cultural formations. Like, how did this event that happened in the 1800s connect to this series of events during the Industrial Revolution, which then fueled these things that happened during the World Wars, and then that showed up on Long Island in terms of the way the GI Bill worked, and what does that mean for urban cities today? Like tracing these narratives through history and through different media, which for me was a really powerful way to think about how things got to be the way they are. Like why when I look around, I see these things in this way. I was just so interested and curious about that.
And so that, that makes sense. I don't mean to draw too clear a line or make these connections too obvious, but I think that the Adopt a Highway thesis makes sense, hearing all of that. And I think it's interesting that you talk about that also as a kind of a graphic design thesis, or a thesis about signage. Where did your introduction to graphic design come in, or was there some sort of shift or expanding of interest from not just urban design or kind of the urban environment, but also the surface, the graphic part of it? You know
I
what I
do.
mean? Does that
Yeah,
make
and
sense?
I've been
Okay.
reflecting on that question in preparation for this conversation, and I think there's a few different. It's funny. So I'm gay, and something that is sort of like a joke that we talk about um, in my community is like, what is your root? Like, what is the moment that you knew that you were gay? Because my wife and I joke about our root being, say, that picture that was taken of me in second grade where I was the only girl in pants in my class photo. It's like, oh my gosh, of course you're gay. So it feels like you're asking me what my root is in graphic design. And so
Oh,
it
interesting.
makes me
Yeah.
reflect all the way back to distant childhood. And I think one root is that I had a lot of hobbies involving paper. The first being reading. I loved to read. The second being really dorky, which is stamp collecting. And the third, I think, being even more dorky, which was making these like cut and assemble paper models, like of Western towns and architectural.
Oh
Like,
yeah, I did. And they came in like little books
yes, they were like
almost.
Dover books. Like they were
Yep,
super
I
cheap.
did that too. Yeah.
I made one of the Space Needle, of like a Crusader castle, of the Sagrada Familia,
Oh
and I like
wow.
loved the like slow. I think I had a bone folder even back in the day. Like to make scores and the cutting and
Yeah.
the gluing, and it was like this so labor intensive and so absurd, but it was something I loved to do. Um, so I think, I wasn't connecting, I wasn't a maker of graphics, but I was a collector of little scraps of paper. And I feel like I'm still someone who loves to collect little scraps of paper. Like I look around my studio and there's business cards that have been slipped under our windshield wiper of, barbers
Mm.
and roofing specialists and auto glass people in Oakland, because they have just such amazing kind of vernacular design that I love. Um, I think, though, I didn't really know about design until I got to college. And something that I did in college, besides American Studies, was I was really greedy to take art classes because I hadn't really taken any in high school. I was really
Mm.
academically focused. And so I became like this classic dilettante who took every intro art class, but never anything beyond that.
Okay.
So, like my first semester, freshman year,
Yeah.
I took basic drawing. And I think my
Okay.
taught by this really, really iconic professor from the Yale School of Art named Robert Reed, who was extremely demanding, sort of legendary basic drawing class where you were spending 20 hours, 30 hours a week working on his projects. And I remember one of his assignments was to pick some object that you had ready access to and draw it just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times. The thing I chose was this like broken umbrella. But there was a guy in my class who's also named Robert.
Okay.
And this guy, Robert, I remember he chose to draw a letter A. Like he had, I don't know, a piece of old signage or something. And he was super nice. I think he was a junior. He was drawing this letter A hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times. And I finally asked him, like, why are you doing this? And he said, oh, I'm a graphic designer.
Yeah.
My name's Rob Giampetro. And I said, wow. Okay. What an odd thing to draw.
Oh, that's
I'm
so
drawing
funny.
umbrellas, and of course I reflect back on that and on meeting Rob then and on kind of being introduced to the obsessive love of letter forms that is so much of graphic design practice as a first semester freshman.
That is so funny. Rob was my first interview for this podcast like 3 years ago. And so it comes full circle. You're like episode 151, I think. I love that connection there. That's amazing. I'm not sure how to ask the question that I'm trying to formulate, but I'm interested in, seeing him draw this A, thinking that this is, somewhat kind of confusing. Why are you doing this? Hearing the answer, I'm a graphic designer. Did that pique your interest? Were you like, whoa, what is that? What does that mean? Can I do that? What was that kind of, let me ask the question this way. You eventually become a graphic designer. So something happened there. Do you remember what that was like?
So I frankly, I don't think it was the moment that Rob told me he was a graphic designer. I think I thought, boy, that's just that is bizarre that that's what this kid has chosen to draw. I admired his rigor, but I was concerned for him, I think, in that moment. But right. As I was saying earlier, I did poke around in all the different art disciplines that were offered at Yale. So I took intro sculpture, I took intro photo, and I took an intro graphic design class with a professor named Henk van Assen. And I loved the class. And the only reason I didn't take a second graphic design class is because in the second class, you had to start using computers. And I was intimidated by computers, which is just so, it's so embarrassing. It's so goofy to say now, given that the computer is, obviously, the computer is my best friend. But at that time, I didn't have a computer. Because you could still, it was early enough that like you could use the computer labs. And so I didn't quite know what the path was. And I also didn't think I wasn't taking art classes because I wanted to be on the computer. I was taking art classes because I wanted to be making things.
Were there connections or was there overlap in the things you were talking about and writing about in your kind of major American studies classes? And, you mentioned these kind of cultural artifacts that you'd be writing papers about. And then you're taking these art classes where you are making things, producing things, drawing, painting, sculpture. Was there overlap between those, or did you kind of, you mentioned earlier that you were just kind of selfish and were wanting to try to do everything. Did that feel kind of split personality when you were doing both of those things?
I think initially it did. I think that the type of criticality that is in play in an art classroom is really different from that in say an academic seminar, except that my senior thesis project brought a lot of things together. Like it was also a photo project. My research involved traveling on this 2-month road trip and interviewing highway adopters all over the country and photographing them with their Adopt a Highway sign, like at the site that they had adopted, and talking with them about why they were involved with the program and learning about their lives and backgrounds, because the program is actually has this sort of interesting political and cultural history where people use the signs as a way to communicate messages. Like, for example, the KKK has adopted sections of highway in Missouri that are school busing lines as a way to intimidate people.
Oh,
Meanwhile,
interesting.
in
Huh.
the Dakotas, an LGBT organization adopted a highway as a way to say, "Hey, we're here," and that sign was
Mm,
shot up by guns. It was constantly stolen. So they had to keep the sign down and only put it up when they were actually doing a cleanup. And so I interviewed people representing both those groups to learn more about, what happened. And so I think that project really brought together my interest in form and my interest in culture.
I think this right here, what you're saying, is really the core of what I'm interested in talking to you about. And so I don't want to spend all of this conversation just kind of going step by step through your biography, if that's okay. Um, so, I mean, you eventually, did you go to, did you get your MFA right after undergrad, or did you work in between that time or take a break between
I
that time?
did not. I worked for 3 years. The first year, I worked for the New York City Police Department, and then I spent 2 years working at an art museum in New Haven.
You eventually kind of, went back to graphic design, I guess, and were able to kind of bring these things together. And I think you kind of talking about the making and the culture, I think, graphic design is such an interesting field where those two things come together. And I'm interested in this background that you had where you were writing these kind of cultural papers, you were taking these art classes. Do you think that gives you some uh, different or interesting or unique perspective than when you went to study graphic design itself, having this whole other line of study beforehand?
That's an interesting question. I think my first response is that I think it means that I take graphic design very seriously because I have
Mm,
seen its impact on the culture. Because that's,
right.
where I didn't encounter it first as someone making cool stuff. I encountered it as someone seeing what it can do
Right.
um, to a people, in terms of behavior and belief. And that's the reason that I went to graduate school, is because, I had spent this time thinking about graphic design from the outside, right? Like as a critic or as someone
Mm-hmm.
as someone who was studying its impact. And I thought, wow, you know, imagine what I can learn about culture if I actually become someone who's contributing to it.
And it's so funny. I just talked to Susan Sellers of Two by
Mm-hmm.
Four, who kind of did the inverse of you in a way, in that she studied graphic design in undergrad and then got a master's in American
Mm-hmm.
Studies, and then returned to start a studio. And she essentially said the same thing, in that she could have very easily had a career being a teacher, professor, doing writing, but there was something about producing the work also, that the kind of like actualizing of it seemed important. I find that so fascinating. I'm curious, kind of uh, the impetus to not just be an observer, a critic, a thinker, but to be someone who can actually use these tools to put things out into the world. What was your kind of, I'm sorry to use this word, but plan or goal or idea uh, while you were studying graphic design? Did you kind of then want to go and make this stuff, to kind of to use graphic design to do these things in the world?
Yeah, I think maybe a strength and a opportunity at Yale is this lack of discussion of the plan.
Right, right.
So it wasn't like people were talking about, yeah, I'm going to take this class so I can get this job with this guy, or that there was there was no resources around careers, and there was not even really an acknowledgement of the market.
Mm.
And like I said, I think that's both a strength and maybe a potential area for consideration.
Yeah,
So I
I'd like
didn't.
to talk about that more in a bit, actually.
That sounds fine. So which is to say, I don't remember having a plan. I think I
Hmm.
thought I would learn how to be a designer and then work in a studio and maybe
Hmm.
eventually have my own studio, maybe have teaching be part of my practice. Um,
Hmm.
but I always thought I would have a job.
Right. Um, so you mentioned that you thought maybe teaching would be a part of your practice, and I'm a fairly new teacher. I've been teaching for 5 years now, for like 4.5 years, I guess it is, as kind of an adjunct.
Hmm.
Uh, Always thinking that teaching was kind of the maybe side piece of my practice. I always kind of thought of myself as a designer first. Um, and over the last 2 years have kind of realized that, and I think we're similar in that I was interested in the cultural side of graphic design. I was interested in am interested in writing, the cultural side, the kind of more critical side. Realize and kind of had that split between being a producer, a maker, and then the intellectual side, and have come to realize that teaching is the way that all of those things come together for me.
Hmm. Hmm.
And for my practice and my interests, they all overlap the clearest. And that does not mean to say that it is clear, but just the clearest in the classroom. Uh, is that similar for you? Is that kind of why teaching was interesting for you? Because that was a way to kind of, it seems like it's a way to bring all of those things together for you, all of this stuff that you're interested in.
Yeah, I think that that's right. After graduate school, I moved to the Bay Area. Eventually, started working at a company called SYPartners
Yeah.
that has an office in New York as well, and has this interesting mix of design and strategy work, and is sort of
Mm-hmm.
structured on a consulting model. So that meant it was a really intense job, lots of travel, lots of sort of deep client work, and I felt like I was teaching on the sly, like that I was sort of stealing hours away to run off to
Mm.
CCA at night, hope that I wouldn't have to travel and miss the next class. But it
Right.
was some of my favorite time was these hours that I was whittling out of my job to go and teach.
So you were doing both at the same time. You were working as a designer, and then you were kind of teaching at night. Um, and now you're the chair of the program at CCA. Uh, was that a conscious kind of decision to, I'm going to flip this? I'm going to be primarily a teacher.
Yes, it was this very clear. So I'd been working at SYPartners for almost 5 years, and teaching probably one class a year was what I was
Oh,
able
okay.
to manage. And then the chair role at CCA came open, and some folks that I knew there said, "Hey, what if you applied? What would that be like?" And I kind of took stock of what I was doing professionally, what my favorite things that I was doing professionally were, and whether I was ready for a new challenge. And I thought, gosh, this seems like a pretty cool job. So it was really like I applied for that job. So it was very
Okay.
much a deliberate transition.
So I didn't realize that you basically were hired as the chair. I knew you had taught before, but I guess I had just assumed that you were kind of full-time teaching and then became the chair. What was that like, going in, from teaching one class a semester to now being chair of the program, immediately like that?
Um, People talk a lot about imposter syndrome, and whenever people use that term, I'm like, no, like don't do that. No one is an imposter. Um,
Mm,
or at least the people who worry about imposter syndrome are not imposters. Um,
mm,
that
mm.
said, I was immediately giving a lot of advice to people about teaching, right? Because I had this faculty of like
Right.
40 people who were coming to me with questions and about my point of view on what they should be teaching, how they should be teaching. And so I sort of quickly had to develop a point of view on how they should be teaching and what they should be teaching. But then when I was teaching myself, I would hear my own voice in my head and think, that's not right. Oh my gosh, like, how could you have told that to people? That doesn't work at all. And so it
Yeah.
was this funny kind of fractured mindset around needing to show up as an expert for people, and then putting it in practice and realizing I still had a lot to learn.
Right. Right. So you were teaching. I'm not totally familiar how CCA works, and I feel like it's kind of different at every school. So it sounds like the chair at CCA also is a full-time teacher, teaching classes while directing the program?
So the way it's structured for me is I teach one class a year, and then
Okay.
my other full-time duties are channeled toward the chair responsibilities. So in a way, my teaching load hasn't changed, right? It's just
Right.
that what I do
Right.
with the rest of my time has changed.
And those, I'm going to ask you just like a kind of series of really kind of technical, practical process questions, because something I'm very interested in and think about a lot is the kind of leadership models of higher education design programs, I
Hmm.
guess, basically. So the chair responsibilities for you, I imagine, are, everything from the administrative, hiring faculty, budgets, bringing in guest lecturers and things like that, but also more, all the way to the other side of kind of strategy things of, here's what this program is, here's what we want to do, here's what we want to kind of give to students. Here's what we want students to kind of take away from this program. Here's how we're connected to the larger community, the local community around us. Are you interested in all of those things? Are you interested in that kind of full administrative budget stuff and the big picture? Here's what we are as a program.
Yes, it's why I like my job. I think that I see people who are in this role who aren't happy. You see grumpy chairs, and when I took this job, I thought, if you get grumpy, you need to stop, because it's too privileged a role to waste time being grumpy in. But in order to not be
Right.
grumpy, you do have to be into some kind of, you know nerdy stuff. And yeah, I
Yeah.
think something that I benefit from is thinking of this job as also part of my design practice. I think
Right.
of the
Right.
chair duties as acts of design.
I'm asking this question 100% selfishly because it's something that I am trying to figure out. And obviously, I am not a director of a program or a chair of a program. I've talked to a bunch of directors and deans. The way my work has gone, I'm doing a lot more of that administrative stuff that I had never done before. And I found that, hey, I actually really like this also.
Hmm.
But the challenge that I've had, that I'm still trying to figure out, and I don't totally like the word balance, but I can't think of a better word for it, of not letting the small stuff get in the way of the big stuff.
Yep.
So when I have to think about something that's like strategy or even like creative things, like putting together a curriculum for a class or writing a lecture even, or putting together a presentation or something like that, the stuff that I need that mental energy for, I'm also thinking, well, I have to respond to these emails. I have to get these meetings on the calendar. I have to, and I don't know how to kind of like, again, this isn't the right word, but balance those so
Yep.
the one doesn't get in the way of the other. How do you
Yep.
kind of deal with that or think about that?
Okay, so I've got some ideas for you, Jarrett. First,
Okay, I love it.
um, something to
I'm just
think
going to turn
about.
this into career advice
Oh,
podcast, I think.
baby. See, I give it. I've got it. I'm going to give you
But
advice, even though I don't really know.
I,
So, okay.
this is perfect.
So think about the distinction between the urgent and the important. Okay, so the urgent
Mm,
is like that email that is blowing up your inbox that you feel like you need to respond to. And then the important is that thing you need to write that's
hmm
going to take real deep thinking. And we have this problem where the urgent is always blocking out the important, like there's
Right.
always
Yeah.
that email. And And I don't know if you're familiar with this mythical figure of the Hydra. A Hydra is like this thing where you cut off its head and two
Oh,
heads grow in its place. And
oh,
so,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
however hard you fight against the Hydra, like it just gets worse. And email is like that. Like the second you
Yeah,
respond to an email, like two more come back. And so, the better
right.
you are at email, the worse you are at everything else. Which isn't to say don't respond to email, but just be careful how good you are with email, because people will realize that, like, oh, this guy's going to write back to me. So I'm going to ask him something that he shouldn't
Mm,
be answering, but I know he'll write back. Like, I do that to
yeah.
people because people take advantage of that. So take care with how good you are with email is one thing.
Oh,
The
I
next
love
is,
that. Yeah.
for me in this job could literally be all email. Like, if
Right.
you let it,
Doesn't surprise me.
you could just live inside your inbox forever.
Right.
And
Right.
so you have to decide to not let, like, the path of least resistance is living inside your inbox. And so you have to
Mm,
say, I will spend an hour or 2 hours or whatever, like doing the emails, and then I will not. I will spend an hour or 2 hours
right.
doing the writing, and you just shut it off however you can
Yeah.
is one thing. And then the other way I think about balance is how I balance my academic, like my responsibilities in the school versus my own practice. And so
Right.
something that's been really valuable for me in terms of my own practice is kind of thinking about the things that I work on as like three different burners on a stove, right? And one of the burners
Mm,
is something that I'm writing. And one of the burners is
hmm
something that I'm getting paid to do that's not part of my CCA work. And then the third burner is something that I'm making that I'm just making because it's something I want to make, some weird thing. And no
Right.
matter what, I want to know what I'm doing in each of those three areas at any given time. It's not like all three burners are all the way lit up all the time, but that there's something
Yeah.
cooking on every burner.
That. Oh, I mean, I'm not going to let this become the rest of the conversation because I totally could, but you are totally hitting me right at the stuff that I'm trying to figure out right now, because that is exactly my kind of personal and I guess professional challenge right now is keeping all of those burners lit at the levels that they need to be when they need to be, because I like I said earlier, I think we're similar in that regard, in that I have like the professional stuff, I have the projects that I'm just kind of doing on my own, I have the kind of writing and thinking stuff, I have the teaching, and it's not just the balance between the email and the thinking, it's also the balance between I have to prepare a class, but I'm also making this other thing that might not go anywhere that's just for me. And I kind of want to work on that more right now. And trying to figure out that. I mean, it's a time management question, I guess, in the end, but that's such a great metaphor.
Oh gosh, and I think that my wife would kill me if I didn't also remind you, since you have a family and I have a family, that like
Yeah.
the only people that actually love you are your family.
Right. Right.
So you, you know what I mean? Like they have to
Yeah.
get the love first.
Yeah. 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 Yes. I want to like flip to the complete opposite side of this question, though, also of not just kind of the tactical, the how you actually do the work, but actually what that work looks like, or kind of where you see it going. And so I'm really interested in how you think about the CCA program. What are your goals for that program, and the ways that you kind of see that moving forward into the future?
It's really interesting to be in San Francisco in this time in this field. You
Mm-hmm.
know, I started working full time at CCA in 2014, and I feel so fortunate that the economy has been so robust in this time, because that means there's jobs for our students. There's a lot of energy around design here in the Bay, which I think
Mm-hmm.
is really exciting and really fortunate in a lot of ways, because I feel like I can responsibly say we're going to deliver this education to you that has this price tag, and you will have opportunities to get a great
Mm-hmm.
job. That said, it's also a really complicated culture and context for a school, because the industry that is booming here is the technology industry, and it is a very noisy industry that can drown out a lot of critical thinking, a lot of other types of
Yeah.
practice. And for example, I will get pretty clear feedback from folks in tech about what we should be optimizing our students for, like what
Mm,
tools they would like us to be teaching so that our graduates can seamlessly transition into product design jobs at, take your pick,
right.
any
Right.
number of
Right.
companies. And they have a really strong point of view, and also potentially a really persuasive one given where resources are flowing. But from my perspective, it would be irresponsible to be thinking about design education in that way, because
Hmm.
who knows what the opportunity is going to be 10 years down the road. And there are lots of much cheaper ways to get skills if all you want to do is skill up. So, what is the value proposition of a design education? It needs to be around much more than skills. So, I think that it's been uh, a really amazing time to be uh, teaching graphic design and teaching design and thinking about the future of design education in the Bay Area. And it's also been a tricky time given the reality of the economy being so robust, but so focused on the technology industry.
Mm.
And, there are certain things that industry wants us to offer our students. There are things that we think our students would benefit from. And then there are things that the students want. So one of the biggest surprises for me when I came in as chair, I thought it would be really easy to start offering workshops in areas that the students wanted to learn skills. Curriculum change takes longer. Let's place
Mm.
some small bets on some new skills. And so I sent a survey to the students saying, hey, what would you like to have a workshop on? Assuming I'd get back things like Python and Raspberry Pi and P5 and
Right.
prototyping. And instead I
Yeah.
got back calligraphy, bookbinding,
Oh, interesting.
lettering. And I was like, what? It was the first moment where the
Huh.
students had really surprised me. And look, I like it when I'm surprised because it means some assumption I didn't know I had is being challenged. But boy, what was I supposed to do with that? Like here we are
Hmm.
in the heart of the future, theoretically, and all
Hmm.
the students want to
Hmm.
do is go backward in time.
That actually really surprised me. I worked in Silicon Valley for a bit years ago, and my experience, which I will admit was a limited experience, was that San Francisco was like very much a industry town, um, and I know that I was like part of the industry, and so it could just be the people that I was associated with and talking to. But I remember standing in lines at coffee shops and hearing people talk about the apps that they were working on and stuff, and it was, you know, admittedly one of the reasons why I felt like I had to leave San Francisco. But my assumption was that the students who would go to CCA might also be like that. And so it's really interesting to hear the opposite.
I think that what I've observed in the Bay Area, which I find fascinating, is that there is this split personality. Like there is
Mm-hmm.
this, obsession with technology and uh, disruption and the future. But there's also this obsession with craft and this love of
Mm,
hand lettering and sign painting and the muralist tradition and graffiti and book arts and zines. um, and then there's like not very much in between in this strange way. And I think
right.
CCA has a history as a craft school. It was founded as through the arts and crafts movement and has this rich
Mm,
legacy of book arts, of folks who are into fine typography, and the sort of a lot of folks from Cranbrook who are these postmodernist image makers. And
right.
so CCA sits as this kind of bastion of craft, even if it's in this context of tech. And so for me, it's been really, really interesting figuring out ways to support that legacy of craft while, pushing toward the future to make sure our students are learning um, skills that are going to make them relevant in the job market, and that they're learning things that just help them fall in love with making, and that they're learning criticality.
How do you do that? That's a question that I ask people all the time on the podcast. It's something I think about literally every day because I'm one of those teachers that's much more interested in uh, the criticality, in the making just to make, in experimenting and trying new things. I'm not as interested in my students producing like really perfectly mocked up things that will go nice in their portfolio. Um, and I always have students that kind of push up against that. And I don't blame them. And I don't necessarily think that they're wrong because they are paying a lot of money
Mm-hmm.
to be there and they are hoping that this will lead to a job.
Mm-hmm.
And I do feel a little bit of a responsibility to help them there also, but I struggle with how to connect all of those things because it sometimes can seem like they can be opposed, and I imagine in a Silicon Valley context that could feel even heightened a little bit. How do you think about that? It kind of goes back to your Yale experience also of the kind of no talk about jobs actually.
Yeah. I mean, so one example that comes to mind is around how we've approached programming. So, like, I had a couple students come to me and say, hey, we really want to do a screening of this documentary called Design Disruptors. I don't know if you've seen this, but
I no, I don't know what this is.
it was commissioned by a company called Envision, and Envision makes
Oh,
prototyping software.
I do know this. Yeah.
So Design
Yeah. I
Disruptors,
never saw it, but I know what this is.
yeah, it's like in a world where technology is the greatest, design is suddenly being awesome too. We will change the world,
Mm-hmm.
boom. And it's like this 75-minute propaganda piece about how awesome the tech industry is, basically. But the students thought it looked cool and they were enamored of it and excited about it. And they'd even already reached out to Envision to get a license to screen it. Like they were, and I love when students are, taking initiative and eager to do something.
Yeah.
And so I
Yeah.
said, yes, and how can we contextualize this in a way that helps people to think more deeply about what this message is? So I asked the students if they had seen Jennifer Daniels' Creative Mornings. Jennifer Daniel is a designer who was at the New York Times. She's now at Google. She's very
She does the emoji
she works on the emoji team.
talk, right? Yeah. I saw her give a talk on that a couple years ago.
Yes, or sorry, she leads the emoji work, but she's also a very provocative voice in design. And she had given a Creative Mornings talk that was basically a 45-minute takedown of Design Disruptors, like sort of a scene by scene critique of how absurd that film was. So I said, why don't we have a double header? Let's show both. And then afterwards, let's have a facilitated discussion about what we've seen. So we can figure out where we stand, having heard a debate around these issues rather than just swallowing one side of them. And I think when we framed it that way, it became a much more interesting opportunity for the students to actually dig in a little bit and try out their point of view on what this meant and who they could be in this context. And then I think in terms of curriculum, to your question, like one area where we've done a lot of work that I'm really proud of is in our interactive classes. When I came in, so all of our students sort of have two so-called interactive design classes that they're required to take as part of their curriculum. And when I came in, like one of those classes was largely dedicated to how to code a bulletproof responsive website, like how to make it work on tablet, on mobile, on desktop. And the students were so proud of what they had done, but they weren't making sites that were like at all nice or interesting. They were just making sites that happened to work across platforms.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
And for me, that is not the point of school. Like, even if your site only works like on a Tuesday morning in Chrome, but it looks amazing and you can document it and it does something in the browser that you have not seen done before, that is more valuable than a site that never breaks but doesn't have anything to say. And
right. I see what you're saying. Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, hopefully, if you can be creative in the browser, you're going to be able to partner with people who can make sure your idea works across browsers or something
Right.
like that.
Right.
And
Right.
so we, Laurel Schwolst, who's a New York based
Yeah. 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 I've
designer.
had her on the podcast.
Oh, great. So Laurel came in and spent a semester with us, helping us think through a new approach to that curriculum. Mindy Sue was also on our
Mm-hmm.
faculty for a couple of years, picking up where Laurel left off. Chris Hamamoto also, is with us full time now, and he's leading that curriculum. So it's, I guess, folks who understand how to be creative in the browser and how to help students feel brave in the browser. So they're still learning
Right.
coding skills, but they're learning how to say something fresh in that environment. And so I think they're still going to getting great jobs, but they're also going to be bringing a point of view that will keep them relevant longer than if they just had some basic coding skills.
Right. Right. So the practical skills are almost presented in a way to be in service of something bigger instead of just, here are the skills that you need to know.
Totally.
Here's how to code a bullet or a responsive website, but it's, here's how to work in the browser so you can say something, so you can do something. That's interesting.
Yeah.
I like that. I'm interested in how teaching and how being in the position that you are in now, does that change how you think of your own work and your own practice outside of teaching, but then also of graphic design in general? Does being someone who's kind of working with students and thinking about this curriculum actually change how you think about what this profession or this discipline is?
Totally, of course. Um, so something that I realized, I think a couple years ago, so I teach type 2 at CCA. It's like a book design class. And I had used for years as an example, Chip Kidd's cover for Jurassic Park as an example of an iconic book cover. And then I think it was 2 years ago, I, showed them the book cover, had them watch his TED Talk. And then I paused because I was getting totally blank expressions from my students. And I was like, do you guys know what Jurassic Park is? And they were like, no, literally not a single one of them had ever heard of Jurassic Park, even though there's been like 8 movies at this point and a theme park and toys and whatever. The book, nothing.
Yeah.
And so I had this moment where I was like, oh my goodness, like a book that I would think everyone would have heard of, they haven't heard of. That probably means they don't know who Tom Cruise is. That might mean they don't know who, I don't know, John Kerry is, or any number of people who I think are super famous are completely irrelevant to them. And not only does that mean they don't know what I know, it probably means that they have all sorts of celebrities and books in their minds that I've never heard of, right? Like, it's not like they don't know what an actor is. They just know about different actors from Tom Cruise or any number of other things. And, I thought, my gosh, if I were looking at this from the outside, I would assume that a 20-year-old is more relevant to culture than a 40-year-old. So I better learn about what they know about. And I also better make sure I know why I'm telling them about Jurassic Park if they don't already know about it. Like, it has to really be valuable as an example, and I have to be able to back it up. And so I guess I think of teaching as a much, much more of an exchange than I used to. Like, teach me what you know, and I'll teach you what I know so that we can both be smarter and know more about the world and the way the world is going. I also, our student population is very diverse. And so I try to understand much more about where these students are coming from in terms of their own cultural references, because the aesthetics that I'm pushing them toward might be just fundamentally at odds with the aesthetics that are native to them.
That was a big one for me when I started teaching, also of just the kind of cultural baggage, I guess, that comes with aesthetics. I'm embarrassed to admit I hadn't thought about much until I started teaching people from all around the world, and is probably like the best thing that I've learned from teaching is kind of opening up the aesthetic possibilities. I think that's great.
I know, it's like as if you'd never been to a restaurant besides the TGI
Yeah.
Fridays. And then you learn about dumplings and you're like, oh my
Yeah.
God, this is
Yeah. Yeah.
amazing.
And I had an experience like your Jurassic Park one, which I actually think your Jurassic Park experience is more shocking than mine. A couple years ago, I taught a publication design class where they basically the whole semester they conceive of and design an entire magazine. And it was a class that had been taught at this school for years before, and the faculty member who had taught it for many years had left, and I came in and at the very last minute and kind of just used that faculty member's syllabus that first semester, and the students were just like producing weird stuff, like it didn't make sense weird, like not in like, oh cool, you're trying something new. It's just like something's not lining up here, something doesn't make sense. And like 5 weeks in, I was like, wait a minute, who here subscribes to a magazine, any magazine? No hands went up.
Right.
Nobody in the class read magazines. And so this thing that I thought was, like Jurassic Park, oh, everybody knows what a magazine is. They knew what a magazine was, but they had no sense of how it's structured or what goes in it or why it's structured this way. And so we like started over and we're like, okay. And then over the years, I've been able to kind of adjust that class to, kind of fit their interests more and bring in more kind of digital components and think about content across different types of formats. But that was like, oh, wow, I have no idea what to do here because I'm teaching something that they, A, don't know anything about, but also B, don't really care about.
I know, but it's so great because like now they're into magazines again. Like things keep changing, like the Frank Ocean stuff. And like we thought with our publication design class, when I first started, we were like, oh, what they need to do is learn how to make an iPad magazine. And then it's like, oh my gosh, turns out that's the worst idea ever. Like iPad magazines suck, but like magazines are back. So I love that it's just going to keep changing.
Yeah. I agree 100%. And it was the same thing, whereas the school was like, oh, well, let's do like digital magazines. And InDesign has this like convert to digital feature. I was like, I don't think that's what we should be teaching them here. I want to go back quickly to kind of the beginning of the conversation as we head into the end. And when you were an undergrad, you talked about you were writing papers about Nirvana and about the Adopt a Highway signs, and writing, which is something we haven't really talked about that much, but is a core part of your practice. And you have continued to write, your entire career. And I'm interested in how your writing practice or maybe even your process, if we want to get that technical about it, how the act of writing for you is different and or similar to the act of designing. How do those kind of relate and talk to each other?
So it's a really good question. And despite being a fairly cerebral person, I haven't thought that much about it. I do think that writing is as much a part of my practice as design. Like it's, if it's a self-initiated project, it usually starts with a question. And then sometimes for me, the right way to answer that question is by writing. And sometimes the right way to answer that question is by making a piece of design. And sometimes the right way is by giving a talk or by planning a gathering or a workshop or putting together an exhibition. Like, I feel really fortunate to have all these different tools or methods, writing being one of them.
For you, I guess, you kind of have these ideas or these thoughts or these questions or things you want to kind of explore. Sometimes writing is the way to do that. Sometimes design is the way to do that. And it kind of all depends. Sometimes it's both. And so it's kind of, whatever medium format process is best for the questions that you're asking.
Yeah. I mean, to give an example, so I've been on sabbatical this fall, and the project that I proposed for my sabbatical had to do with virtual reality hardware. in particular, this phenomenon where actually both VR software, like the development platforms and the hardware, seems really optimized for shooting. Like when
Mm.
you are developing in the Unreal Engine, the default artboard is a first-person shooter perspective, and you have to actually undo a lot of stuff if you want to do something besides develop a shooting game.
Mm.
And
Hmm.
the form of the hardware, like in terms of the hand controllers, is really around this sort of trigger format that's also best for shooting. Like, I don't know if you've used VR, but it's much harder to like really feel like you're picking something up in a
Oh,
way
yeah,
that
yeah,
feels
yeah.
authentic
Yeah.
compared to shooting something. It feels great to shoot stuff. It feels really awkward to pick stuff up.
Hmm.
And I was really disturbed by that and curious about that. So I decided to propose to learn about why the form was that way and to propose alternative formats that would encourage other kinds of behaviors.
Mm.
So it was a very open, self-initiated
Yeah.
brief, could take any number of forms in terms of what I actually made. And the things that I have made or are finishing up as part of that research, the first was I reached out to a museum in Oakland that is like a video game museum, because I know that
Mm.
probably the format of VR hardware is influenced by game hardware. And they had this huge
Hmm.
collection sort of from the very beginning of video games of all these, controllers and consoles. And I asked if I could curate an exhibition of strange controllers, just so I could
Mm.
learn about sort of unorthodox formats. And they were like, sure. And so part of the summer was around learning about their collection, researching the controllers, and putting together a show of some of the weird ones, like the Nintendo Power
Oh,
Glove
cool.
is an
Yeah.
example of one of
Yeah, yeah,
those,
yeah.
or other things like that. So that was, that research took the form of working with an archive and then creating an exhibition. And it was not only curating the exhibition, but designing the panels and writing the text and building the
Right,
structure
right,
for
right.
sort of all these different parts. um, and then I ended up becoming particularly interested in the Microsoft Xbox controller. And I should say I'm not a gamer by any means, so I again feel like a bit of an imposter. But um, something that I learned is that the Xbox controller is being used and has been used for years by the United States military in battle equipment. So they'll
Huh.
take an off the shelf Xbox controller and use it to pilot a nuclear submarine, for example.
What?
I know,
Oh,
right?
interesting. Yeah,
Because
okay.
soldiers know how to use them and they only cost 40
Huh.
bucks. So practically speaking, it seems like a great idea. Um, you know, Needless to say, I found it quite disturbing that that's happening. So
Yeah.
I, proposed a paper to the upcoming design conference about this subject. So I'm currently writing a paper for that conference that's about
Mm.
this blurring of the line between tools and weapons and what
Yeah.
that means. And then meanwhile, I'm also working on creating this piece of discursive design responding to this issue by casting an Xbox controller in lead, um, as
Mm.
a way to, I guess, call attention to the way the controllers are being used in the military. Lead is what
Yeah.
bullets are made out of. Lead is extremely heavy. Lead is extremely toxic. So taking a toy, the form of a toy, but then rendering
Right.
it in this other substrate will, I think, bring new meaning to it.
Oh, that's so interesting. I'm like you, I don't know anything about games. I've never had a gaming console in my life. Um, and all of that sounds so interesting to me. I look forward to that paper. Um, my last question is this is a question that I used to end all of these conversations, but as I was researching you, I found an old piece that you had posted on Medium of kind of summer reading recommendations.
Mhm.
And I always end these conversations kind of asking what people are reading right now. And I love those recommendations. I had read uh, The Sellout and A Visit to the Goon Squad that you recommended. Those are
Oh,
two books that
nice.
I love also. The other two I was not familiar with, so I've added those to the list. But I'm curious, what are you reading right now, or what have you read recently that you've really liked?
Um, oh man, that's such a good question. I read. Can I? Let me just. I have a list that I want
Go
to
for it.
reference. Let's see. Oh my gosh. It's hard because I read okay. So basically my wife reads like 4 times as many books as I do, and then I read every 4th book that she like highly recommends because she's
Oh,
an
interesting. Okay.
amazing, and most of it is fiction. So I
Okay.
read a lot of contemporary fiction, like um, I don't know. My mom got me The Dutch House by Anne Patchett and this like Gentleman in Moscow book that like all the book clubs are
Oh,
reading,
yeah, yeah,
which were really great winter break reads, kind of tore through them. In
yeah.
terms
Okay.
of
Nice.
my research right now, I'm reading a book called Joystick Soldiers, which is
Mm.
about the relationship between the military and video games. It's my research for the
Hmm.
Xbox controller project. I'm also reading a book of essays called Blank Sign Book by Anne Leslie Seltzer. We have a really
Mm.
great bookstore and small publisher in Oakland called Wolfman Books. And this is like a
Okay.
Wolfman Books project. So I was excited to pick that up. Um, I mean, the Jenny Odell book is on my nightstand. I know you read it, I think, for
Oh,
a
yeah.
previous
Yep.
interview. And I think she's really, really smart. Gia Tolentino is also amazing. I don't know if you've read her writing, but
That I've read her writing. Her Trick Mirror is sitting next to my bed. It's probably the next book I'll read.
yeah, Trick Mirror is amazing. I think also I am thinking of her because she had a piece on the New Yorker Online recently on Instagram face, which I thought was really, really great.
Oh, I
And
missed that. Okay.
um, it's sort of about this idea that like everyone's face is merging into this Kim Kardashian face because of Instagram and
Huh.
plastic surgery in Los Angeles. But yeah, I think like to that point of the summer reading piece, like I really, really love it when my students or my colleagues are reading books that are not about design,
Yeah. Yeah.
because I think that over the a couple months ago I read this really I did a like a I did a review for like a manuscript for Bloomsbury, and sometimes they'll just pay you in books. So they sent me like a
Oh, yeah.
bunch of books. Um, one of them was this really great graphic novel. Okay, Good Talk. Have you heard of Good Talk?
That sounds familiar.
Anyway, it's a graphic novel by Mira Jacob. It was so great. Um, yeah, also 2 books by Madeline Miller, Song of Achilles and Circe. Sorry, Madeline Miller
Oh,
wrote
yeah, 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 yeah.
these 2 books that are like reimaginings of, figures from Greek mythology. One is
Yeah.
about Achilles and
Yeah.
Patroclus, the other one is about Circe, and they were both like not super somehow middle brow enough that I wasn't feeling like I was having to read Homer, but highbrow
Right.
enough that they were really like beautiful and well crafted. So yeah, I think those are some books that I'm reading recently, and I just think it's so great when students and designers read fiction and don't
Yeah.
just read design blogs.
Yes. That is such a great way to wrap up this conversation, because I feel like that's exactly how I feel. And I think, 10 years ago, everything I read was design related. And I don't mean to say that I don't read any design stuff now, obviously the, research and teaching and stuff. But the amount of fiction that I've read over the last, 5 years has just increased dramatically, and I couldn't be happier about it. And so I agree with you completely. I love that. I think it's a nice message to kind of to wrap up with, and to kind of to close out the conversation. This was so fun for me. This was such an interesting conversation. Thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you, Jarrett. My pleasure.
This episode was recorded on January 10th, 2020. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts, and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.